Hello and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie. The Christian church has been around for over 2,000 years, and during that time it's been many different variations and many different iterations in its life. I've studied many of them, so when I hear of a church that tries to do things in a new way, my ears perk up. My guest today is Pastor Bruce Jones, head pastor at Imagine Church in South Charlotte, North Carolina. And you're doing church in a new way, I understand. In fact, I went on your website and I pulled this quote off. It says, "Imagine doing church differently."
Right.
So first of all, thank you for joining me today. And secondly, can you tell me what it means to do church differently?
Well, thank you, Ozzie. It's a privilege to be here with you today. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah.
When Imagine Church was first formed, it was 10 years ago, with the idea that church just really wasn't working in America the way we believe it was intended to work. And so the idea was to look at doing away with the things that just didn't work anymore and focusing on those things that did. Out of that came the idea of Imagine doing church differently. And honestly, that was born through a lot of Imagine statements that we shared, such as imagine a church that was able to express God's all-inclusive love. Imagine a church that was open to all people from all walks of faith and all walks of life without question, just with open-armed acceptance. And out of that came the name Imagine Church.
Mm-hmm. When I hear Imagine, I think of John Lennon, but it's a different kind of Imagine. But when I think about it in terms of Christianity, I think of reform movements. Mm-hmm. Pope Gregory the Great, Martin Luther, Jonathan Edwards, even Robert Schuller. Do you see your church here as part of an overall kind of reformation of the church in America?
Certainly, in a way. There is a resurgence of what God is doing in the world today in different pockets of places. I read a statistic the other day that kind of shocked me. There are about 4,500 churches closing in the United States each year. Less than 1,000 new are being built. We're one of that 1,000 for the year 2024. But what we're finding is that sometimes the traditional patterns just do not have appeal anymore to younger adults. And so we really started from that perspective. What is something that is meaningful and relevant to young adults today? And how can we translate that to the church in a way that makes sense? I started in ministry years ago, decades ago now, in youth ministry. But what I found is that what we did in those settings was just so alive and so different, but so vital to teenagers and is reaching them in an important way. We begin to hearken back to that and wonder how we can do those things in today's world in a way that makes sense and that are relevant. And so that's really kind of the mindset that we had as we began to form the Imagine Church movement 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. Imagine Church is different. You don't join Imagine Church. We don't have formal membership. We focus much more on belonging, which we think is more important than actually joining. And so instead of the traditional institutional or organizational models, we really look at this as a gathering of Christ followers. And it really has reached lots and lots of young people, young families for whom this is the first time they've had a faith experience, and then others who kind of had a bad church experience years ago who had given up on church and are trying it again for the first time in a long while.
Right. Yeah, so one way you describe the church is multi-denominational, not non-denominational, and I guess you're not connected to any other kind of external group.
That's correct.
Are you a church of one, or is this a part of a larger movement that you foresee?
Right now it is a church of one. Mm-hmm. We are a part of the International Council of Community Churches only because we want people to realize that we are part of the worldwide body of Christ. We're not just an independent organization floating out here on our own.
Right.
But at the same time, we try to stay away from denominational world because that just really was not what we were called to do or to be. And so we really do focus on what's happening in this corner of God's kingdom in the Southeast Charlotte region, and just to focus on what God is doing here in His vineyard here.
So you mentioned young people and young adults. Do you think, is that your predominant clientele? Is maybe not the best word, but
it is both multi-denominational in terms of tradition, because we do have people from a variety of different faith backgrounds. We feel like that strengthens the whole. But it's also very multi-generational in that we do have more people my age or even older than I would have expected. If you look at the demographics of Imagine Church, however, you would guess that their pastor's probably 30 years old, because we really do have lots and lots of young people, lots of kids and lots of teenagers. And it just seems like the style of ministry seemed to work for them. But we have what we call a kind of a theology of the via media, as Adam Hamilton would call it, the wide middle. We're not called to be Pentecostal. We're not called to be Episcopalian. We're just kind of comfortably in the middle. But we really do focus on grace. If you want to find churches that focus on judgment, my goodness, lots of them you can choose from.
Yeah.
That's not what we really believe that Christ called the church to be about. And so we really focus on the personality of Jesus, who was accepting, who was relevant, who was enjoyable. A lot of churches forget that part, it seems.
Yeah.
But also, he spoke with meaning to people where they were, and that's where we start. You don't have to change to come into God's grace. You know, when you intersect with God's grace, you may change in 1,000 different ways. But God accepts you as you are and for who you are. That's what we do too.
So, since you're talking about grace and acceptance, one of the phrases that caught my attention on your website in describing what your church is like is the phrase open-armed acceptance.
That's right.
Can you describe that a little more?
That's right.
Yeah.
We find that most of the people coming to Imagine carry their own baggage with them. They're hurting, they're broken, they've had some tough life experiences. And the thing that really spoke to my heart in the beginning was before we had a building, before we even had a meeting place, I'd meet people in the community and ask them if they'd be willing to try a church that did church differently. When I'd say that, they would say, "Church, why would I want to come to church? I feel bad enough about myself as it is. Why would I want to do something that makes me feel worse about who I am?" And I realized we've got to turn that around somehow. That's where open-armed acceptance became something that we really believe in, that became part of the core personality or core value of our church. You are welcome for who you are, and we just believe that and apply that to everyone.
What about the phrase risk-taking love? That was another phrase that caught my eye on your website, the idea of love being risky. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that, because nobody does. That's something that is important to us, however, because that's what Jesus did. Who did Jesus spend his time with? Tax collectors and sinners. Those are the ones who gathered around to hear him when he would speak. And the religious people of his day wondered, why is he not spending time with us? But that's who Jesus came for. That's what we're here for. Very often in my prayers in worship, I'll pray, God, send us the people that nobody else wants. Because those are the ones we believe that God wants to reach. And in fact, when we gather on Sunday, if there are one or two people there whose lives are changed because of what God's doing in Imagine Church, we believe heaven celebrates that. And that's biblical. That's what Luke 15 says. And those of us who are the righteous ones, I think God's glad we're there, but we are not God's purpose, and we are not God's first point of interest. It's those that really need him, those that are beaten down by life, who maybe are without hope or convinced that there's nothing really here for them. Those are the ones we really want to reach, and when we do, as I said, I believe heaven celebrates with us.
So you started this church from scratch. I mean, you had ministries prior to this, but that has to take a lot of administrative acumen, as well as being versed in preaching and theology and counseling and everything else. What was it like just starting from the beginning and not only envisioning a new church, but actually then going out and drawing people in and organizing it and finding a space for it?
Honestly, Ozzie, if you want to know the truth, it was euphoric. Because I was serving in a pretty traditional church in western North Carolina, and a group from the Charlotte area came and approached me about doing something different with them, because they felt like that generally church just wasn't getting anywhere and not really meeting human need. And so, as I said earlier, we began to focus not on the things that are typical for churches. What are the things that are atypical? What are the things that churches ought to be doing but maybe they're not? That's when we decided we're not going to go down the institutional road. We really wanted to be more of a gathering of Christ followers. So we focused on that. And instead of starting with bylaws, we started with conversations with people. If people want to know what we stand for, let's talk about that rather than hand them a piece of paper. And that kind of mindset led into something that really became, in some respects, dramatically different in terms of its approach to church. We had lots of dream meetings in the beginning. And that's when a lot of this began to crystallize as to what God was calling Imagine Church to be and to do. And we started with that and really have never strayed far from that. And so we don't really focus that much on structure. We don't have committees. We have teams, self-directed teams. And the basic leadership team is really a permission-granting entity. And if somebody has a vision for ministry that fits kind of the core objectives of Imagine Church, we tell them, go to it, do it. If you need people, find the people. If you need money, raise the money. I mean, that's not, we're not in the business of giving money, but just raise it.
Right.
And it doesn't work for everybody. There are some that we have found that attached themselves to us for a while and then left because it was just a little too loosey-goosey for them. But for lots of people who come from non-religious backgrounds, they find this speaks to them with meaning and relevance. And so we kind of begin to focus on that and not worry that much about structure. What we've learned is that if God gives you a what, focus on that what, don't worry about the how, because the how is more God's providence than it is ours. And what we've found in almost every case is, if we just are faithful to answering the what and pray, God will somehow provide the how. And we have story after story of that in Imagine Church's history that have proven that.
Sounds like you got a lot of risk-taking going on. And yeah, that's right. The other thing you don't have on your website is a creedal statement. And I guess that's part of, I think at one point you say that faith is not a list of check boxes of what one must believe. There's a movement in American Christianity called Emerging Church, which focuses on orthopraxy and practice rather than belief. Has this movement influenced Imagine Church?
To a slight degree it has. You're right, we don't look at items of faith as being rigid boxes to check, but springboards into imagination and Christian service. What we often say to people when they come is, whoever you are, wherever you are on your faith journey, there's a place for you here. And we believe that. We have people on different rungs of the ladder of faith, and there's some in our church that are way further along that spectrum than I am, who just have lived a life of faith for decades and lived and served faithfully. Others are brand new to the faith, and this is all a time of discovery for them. All have their place, and we learn from each other in that. And so we really don't look at creedal uniformity as being that which God is maybe most interested in. I think our faithfulness is what really gets God excited. Our confident faith in Him is what really, I think, brings God great pleasure. That's what we focus on. And people are at different places on that spectrum. But we add it all together, it really creates a pretty lively and healthy whole. There are young believers who can learn from those who are older, who've been in the faith for a long time. But for those of us who've been in the faith for a long time, it's wonderful to be with people for whom the faith is new and alive and bright, because it puts us back in touch with where we were once upon a time, and maybe we've lost some of that. Yeah,
and there's something about that intergenerational interaction that's really healthy, I think, for both ends of the spectrum. Do you say a lot of your congregation is made up of young people? Some of them had bad church experiences, some of them have had no church experience. Do you sense that there's a commonality in today's generation, younger generations, a sense of, I don't know, lostness or loneliness, or is there anything that you see that would that comes up that brings them to church in the first place? If they've had bad experiences or no experiences, how do they find their way to Imagine Church?
That process of seeking is something I think that stays with us our whole lives. And even if we have had a bad church experience and moved away from church, I think for many people there's still something in them that harkens for something more than this world can offer on its own. What we found is something that has surprised us. We met on a seminary campus for 9 years, met 1 year at an Episcopal school, then had a chance to move to the seminary. But during that time, that process I mentioned earlier of God providing the how came to us in a rather staggering and unexpected way, that we were able to obtain land and then build a really neat contemporary facility. But what we did not expect was how much that was going to influence people just by itself. A lot of people have commented on the old Field of Dreams, Kevin Costner movie. There's some truth in that. If you build it, they'll come. Because we were able to buy land in a growing area, and for the 2 years we were in construction, lots of people rode by that church, and the design was so contemporary and unusual in some respects that it seemed to pique people's curiosity, and they began to send us emails and text messages that said, let us know when you're going to open because we want to be there. We were stunned because Imagine Church from 1 week to the next tripled in size from our last Sunday at the seminary to when we moved in our own facility, and we were overwhelmed by that. But our teams really have stepped up. They have really answered the call and responded in beautiful ways. But what we found is a lot of commonality among these young people that came, many of whom didn't know each other. Some of them did because they're coming from these new neighborhoods all around us. But when they begin to talk to each other, we have a cafe out in front of the worship center. And as they gather in that cafe and begin to share their stories, they begin to realize, my experience is a lot like theirs. We have people who've been away from church for 20 years, some who've never been part of a faith community before, who are trying it out. And what's happening is they're forming relationships with each other, which is a really neat thing to witness and observe.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the new church. Let's talk about that a little bit. And we've got some pictures here because not only did you start a new church community, but you shepherded the building of this magnificent facility here. What's it like to build a church? I mean, it must be you're getting input from people in the community, I suppose. You're getting architects coming in and trying to raise money.
It's like adding a part-time job on top of what else.
Well, maybe a full-time job.
But yet just a glorious experience to be a part of something like this. Let me tell you how it happened, if you can give me just a moment.
Absolutely, I'm interested in this.
This is how God worked in a remarkable way. Early on in the formation of Imagine Church, I kind of had the vision that we likely would not build because it was just too expensive, and we didn't want to put that kind of money into brick and mortar when we could serve God by other means. However, we had a couple that became a really dear part of the church family early on, and it really began to change their lives. And this was a couple that owned a business that they had begun some decades ago that was very successful. They never went public with it, never sold stock. But God began to use the Imagine Church experience to speak to them in a new way. And they called me one year, 2017, on my birthday, and said, "We want you to come and meet with us in our home." And they shared with me that they really felt like that God wanted them to do something for their church to help us someday buy land. And God used that one couple to help us buy 16 acres with a pond that was a farm in a perfect location. And the gentleman also told me, he said, "Bruce, we really feel led to do something to help the church build when that day comes." What we didn't expect is that illness claimed his earthly life about a year later, and I thought at that point the dream was gone. His wife, however, told me, "No, we're going to continue this. We're going to continue to do what my husband and I wanted to do and keep this dream alive." We're not able to build this solely on what they gave, but it made it possible. Otherwise, I don't know that it would have been. But she really became chair of the design team, and through her vision and through the prayers and efforts of lots and lots of people, this began to develop. And yeah, we found an architect and we developed some building plans. We're able to be creative because we had so many kids and so many teenagers. Meeting at the seminary was great, except those rooms were all designed for adult education.
Right. Yeah.
And so we began to think about how can we be creative with space to do something that speaks with meaning to children and speaks with meaning to teenagers. And now on a given Sunday, we can have anywhere from 80 to 100 teenagers and around 50 kids from birth to 5th grade. But not only are you going to reach them, their parents are going to come with them because they're not going to just come and drop off their kids. Yeah. And so it really has become a fascinating thing to watch how God has used building space, but how God used the vision and the resources of one couple through whom God touched their lives and changed their lives through Imagine Church. Without that, and maybe God would have done it a different way, but I think without that, this never would have happened.
That's a great story. And the building is unconventional, as you said. And I guess when you're in the process of doing this, you have to imagine ways to balance functionality with creating sacred spaces as well. That must have been some interesting conversations that you had with people, and this woman who was the design leader had. So did you have at the end of this a sanctifying ritual that dedicated the space in some way? Or is it...
We will October 27th. Haven't gotten to that yet.
Oh, okay.
But we did put some really creative additions into the building to create that sacred space. The building obviously is very contemporary and very functional in terms of its layout. It opens into a large commons area with a cafe, worship center on one side, then an office area. The other side is totally designated to Imagine Kids and Imagine Youth. But the design team had the idea of doing some creative things. We wanted to have a means by which people could leave prayer requests, and we didn't want something as mundane as a prayer box. So we developed a prayer column. We took one of the columns and created it in such a way that it duplicates the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, a Judeo-Christian symbol that has been meaningful for generations, and allowed that to be the place where people come and leave their prayer requests and prayer concerns, and they're there every week. we had this one little unusual niche in one corner of the worship center that we wondered what to do with it. And again, this same woman, whose name is Danielle, had the marvelous idea of creating with a piece of art and a baptismal bowl, a place where one can go and dip the water and touch his or her forehead and remember their baptism and be thankful. So there's some little touches like that that we've kind of had to explain to the church family what this means and what it's there for.
Right.
But again, for people who have not had a previous faith experience, those things we found are deeply meaningful to them. Plus we have other things like that throughout the buildings. We did some really neat murals, especially in the children and youth area, that allow the faith to be translated to children in a powerful, important way. That's been the most beautiful thing that we've experienced, of the kids that say to their parents, we want to come back here. This is where we want to be. Yeah. That's what we really want to do with young children, is just create in their minds the idea that church is a fun, neat place to be. They're learning something about faith, but they also have the role model of caring adults outside their parents who love them and care for them for who they are.
Yeah. There really is a lot of creative imagination going on in this place. I've got a couple more pictures here that just, I love the stone and this kind of contemporary style cross here, which was on the front. And let's go to the next picture, because this is something special. Tell me about these doors here.
Each of those things, Ozzie, has a story. The cross itself has a story, the natural stone. But we bought a farm, and we wanted to do some things that kind of remind people this was once a farm. We have a barn on the property we kept. It's still there. But the barn doors kind of came out of that idea. They open up into a pretty wide entranceway into the worship center. Those barn doors are 16 feet high. There are 3 of them on each side, and they roll on rollers on the top. And when you open that wide opening, we were thinking of that verse of scripture that says there's a wideness in God's mercy like the wideness in the sea. Actually, I think that's a hymn. But we want people to know that the door is wide for you to come into God's grace and God's love and God's kingdom. There are no barriers, hoops, or hurdles that we have to jump over or cross through to come to God's grace and God's love. God's waiting for us, and that's what we wanted to symbolize when we open those barn doors for people to come into worship on Sunday. That's kind of how that came about.
It's really spectacular.
Thank you.
So here you are preaching in the unfinished. How long did it take to build this church, by the way?
We were told 12 months. It was a little bit off. It was 26 months.
Okay, 26. So a little longer than you wanted. But well, it took 200 years to build Notre Dame.
That's right.
So you're well ahead of that schedule. So here you're in the unfinished space, I suppose, right? And I'm assuming that there's another picture of the finished space right here. Quite a difference. So what's your typical worship service like here? I see that you've got a band up on the stage.
We do. What we were doing on that other shot, by the way, we invited people to come up there, and we gave them all black felt tip markers. We just had the beams up, all the different...
Maybe go back to that picture in the unfinished space. I want to see...
We just had all the beams and things, but we invited people to leave a scripture verse or a personal message on those different beams, and they did. They obviously were going to be covered up, but they'll always be there. 50 years from now, those things will still be there. I think one of the failures of modern church, I'm afraid, is just a failure of imagination and not be able to think outside the box. And we tried to do that, and just some of it comes off maybe kind of goofy, but a lot of it seems to have meaning to people, to just be creative with what we do. We do the same thing with worship. Worship is to some degree video driven, because we use lots of video clips that we create and then we get from other places. We do have a band, have a wonderful worship in the arts leader who's been with us since day one, named Jennifer, who's extraordinary to work with, and she's wonderfully creative with what she does with both music, with drama. And our worship style is it is pretty casual, pretty laid back, but yet there are some liturgical elements at Imagine Church. We have the sacrament of communion every month. We do recognize the Christian season and honor the special days in our Christian heritage. But the worship style is, again, it combines what I think both are necessary in human life, warmth and reverence. And we try to focus on both of those things. In addition to my preaching, many Sundays we'll have just a spoken story from somebody in the church to share a little bit of his or her life experience, or what her family or his family or their family has experienced together, how God has intersected with their lives and changed their lives. Those things are really meaningful. I think people kind of like the message. We do series preachings, but we strive for relevancy. But at the same time, what they hear from each other in those different stories we share in worship is really impactful and has met lots of human need, and we're grateful for that.
All right. Well, let's go to this last picture again, the interior of the worship space. And of course, this doesn't look anything like a medieval cathedral or even the church I grew up in with pews and stained glass. It's very contemporary, very comfortable. And then you've got the band with modern instruments. So it looks like a kind of high-powered, high-energy kind of musical scene. Do you have a music director, or
that's Jennifer, the same?
That's Jennifer, the arts person.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Worship style is not rock and roll, but it's certainly not traditional. It's pretty much what you hear on Christian radio. Those are the songs we use that really seem to resonate with folks in a meaningful way. We have a killer band. We really do. We're very blessed with the musicians that we have. And we start with music and then move through other elements of the service and then end with my message. Very often some kind of invitation or opportunity for people to respond to the word, and then close with music again.
Yeah. So with a name like Imagine Church, you have to always be looking into the future, thinking about innovation. What do you think the next great thing for this church is, or where do you see yourself headed in the next few years?
What we've encouraged our new people to do, because on a given Sunday now, we'll have 150 what we consider part of the Imagine Church family. We don't have membership, but they're participants, regular participants. We'll have 150 of those and 250 guests that we don't know. So our key right now is getting to know them, and the way to do that is to plug them into what I mentioned this past week. It's called Worship Plus 2. We ask and challenge each individual to worship regularly, plus one area of their own personal spiritual growth, which in our church means life groups. Become part of a small group that meets in homes during the week. And then one area of your Christian service. Receive something for yourself, but give something back to the community or the world. And we're very missions conscious. We have life groups that help meet that personal spiritual growth need. But we have lots of teams that are involved in mission work and ministry in the community, but also in the world. And that's what we urge people to be a part of, because to really be able to experience the Christian faith as we believe Jesus intended, you need all three. Worship with the body, be part of a small group, but also give something back to the world and to God's creation.
Quickly, give me an example of a small group or a life group, as you called it. So that comes out of maybe the megachurch model, where you have larger congregations and small groups. Give me an example of one of the life groups in your church.
Life group be made up of 10 or 12 people, couples and individuals. Typically meet in homes, meet every other week. And they meet for three things: for Bible study, for prayer, and just for sharing life together. Let me give you an example. We have a young woman named Kelly who went through a extremely difficult and challenging year with cancer. She credits her life group for helping get her through that, because she said she found God time and time again through that year because of the way her life group responded to her, taking her to her medical appointments, being there to pray with her when she's in the hospital, bringing food by for she and her daughter when she had just gotten back from the hospital or taking her chemo treatments. And she will tell you to this day that she's a part of a church that she loves, but the church within a church for her is that life group, those 12 people who ministered to her when she really needed someone to.
Wow. That's a remarkable story. A 10-year journey from nothing to what you see here now. So that's quite an accomplishment.
It's amazing what God will do. Pay attention.
That's the how part of the what, right?
That's right. That's right.
Well, thank you for joining me today.
Thank God.
Yeah, I think we see more and more of this type of worship and this type of church in the American landscape. So hope you have a really prosperous future.
Thank you so much. It's been a privilege.
Thank you. Well, that's it for Religion and Life for this week. I hope you'll join us next week on App TV, when my guest will be Samantha Stone, a dancer with spiritual roots. Until then, this is Ozzie Ostwald.